Mill has given us a sort of baseline set of instructions for figuring out what sorts of pleasures are better than others. He says that basically, at the first glance, we just take a poll. We figure out, well, what do people in general tend to prefer more? Now, we don't actually take a poll, of course, but we just ask ourselves, what do most people tend to prefer? Because they're probably right. It ends up, however, that a lot of people get this wrong because they've killed off their higher faculties. He basically thinks that a lot of the sort of masses are dumb people. They've fallen into temptation and they can't really recover. You might of course question this, but here's what Mill thinks. If this is true, he thinks we need to trust what he calls competent judges. These are people who've known both sides. These are people who haven't killed off their higher faculties. Because of course, even though you have higher faculties, doesn't mean that you can't also enjoy low pleasures like a good cheeseburger or something like that. These are people who've known both the really high pleasures and the low pleasures, and he'll say that, look, the competent judge always prefers the higher pleasure, things like intellect, morality, doing the right thing, these kinds of things. So our poll, the sort of people that we trust when trying to figure out what we should do, should only include the best informed, the intellectual, competent people. Now it's important to remember at this point that utilitarianism isn't about what makes you happier. Right? It would be a crazy doctrine to say that the right thing to do is always what makes you the happiest. Because that would, of course, lead you to do terrible things like steal and murder and all, just bad, right? This is clearly wrong. What it's actually about is what makes the world happier, what makes the most amount of happiness in the world, no matter who it belongs to. And he'll say that noble characters make the world better off, people with the right kind of noble character. Even if it makes these same people sadder. Right, so they might need to make a sort of sacrifice to make the world a better place, and this is what's the right thing to do is. So here's what's best. First of all, we need to eliminate as much pain and suffering as possible. This is the worst thing, we need to get rid of that. Once we start being able to create happiness, because we've eliminated as much pain and suffering as possible, now we should make as much happiness as possible. But that happiness needs to be of the right kind, right? It's not just how much pleasure we can create in the world, it's how much of the right kind we can create in the world. And this is what's given to us by the competent judge. We might consider a second objection here. Right, the first one, of course, is utilitarianism a doctrine worthy of swine? The second one says, well, wait, what if it's impossible to be truly happy? What if we're just not capable as human beings of real, true happiness? Well, Mill will say two things to this. First of all, it's not. We can be pretty darn happy. And even if it were, he'll say, it doesn't even matter, because utilitarianism doesn't say the only thing that's right is when you can attain true perfect happiness. It says that things are better as they get closer. So it's still pretty obvious, he thinks, and I tend to agree with him, that even if true happiness is impossible, you can still alleviate suffering, right? You can make sure that there's less pain, less sadness in the world. And even if true happiness is impossible, you can still make people happier, right? And isn't it still better to be a little happier, even if you'll never get to perfect happiness, than to just say, well, I give up, and leave it at that? And this seems like a pretty plausible response. The second part of this objection says, well, wait, doesn't being noble mean sacrificing happiness for others? Aren't the best kind of people the ones who give up their own happiness? And Mill will say, yeah, sure, you can learn to sort of do without, but just doing without happiness seems dumb, right? It's not purposely making yourself unhappy that's good. First of all, you almost never have to, and second of all, you always sacrifice with a goal, right? Just making yourself less happy is dumb. The reason you make yourself less happy is usually for the sake of someone else, and it's usually for their happiness, to make them somehow happier or better off. And this is exactly what utilitarianism just said we should do, so this isn't really an objection at all. The result here is an interesting one, because it ends up that in utilitarianism, motives don't matter. Remember, for Kant, motives were almost all that mattered. So utilitarianism conflicts with Kant because it thinks that motives really don't matter. It doesn't matter why I act, it just matters what happens in the end. So we can think of two examples here. In the first one, we can imagine there's a drowning child in a lake by the side of the road or something. And Kant says, it doesn't matter necessarily whether I save the child or not. What matters is whether I did it for the right reason. Utilitarianism says that's crazy, just do it, right? All that we care about is whether this child lives or dies, not whether you did it for the right kind of reason. The second example is a more nuanced one maybe. It involves lying to a friend. Kant says don't do it ever, right? On Kant's theory, you can't ever lie. Utilitarian's going to say, well, you can do it, but only when the results are worth it. And what makes it worth it depends on what might happen in the end. We might think this is either a good or a bad thing depending. And we'll talk more about this in our next video.